A young girl disappeared from her apartment, which she rented with her sister. The police could not find a single piece of evidence, and the case remained frozen for many decades. Only 53 years later, they managed to find out the terrible truth, and this happened in a very unusual way. Pamela Dorrington was born on November 23, 1948 in the small American town of Helen, Montana. She grew up in a friendly family and had many friends. Her friends noted that the girl was responsible from an early age and could always come to their aid. Pamela also loved animals, and her parents bought her a black Labrador. She studied excellently at a local school, and in high school she was interested in studying the Russian language. After school, the girl got a job as a medical assistant in the surgical department at St. Peter's Hospital, located in her hometown. Despite the fact that her parents' house was relatively close to work, Pamela sought to establish an independent life. For this reason, she moved out from her parents and settled in a rented apartment with her cousin Mary, who worked at the same hospital. The girls rented a two-room apartment on the second floor of a residential complex. Early on the morning of February 17, 1968, Mary went to work at the hospital. Pamela was still sleeping, as she had to start her evening shift that day. The Labrador also slept in her room. A few hours after Mary left for work, Pamela's father drove past their apartment complex. Near the building, he noticed his daughter's Labrador running around without a leash. A week before, the dog broke free and ran away from its owner, and Pamela had to take him from the local shelter. Therefore, what he saw did not surprise the man. He knocked on the door of their apartment, but there was no answer. Thinking that his daughter had gone to work, he took the dog and left. Pamela was supposed to go to work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but she never showed up at the hospital. Her cousin tried to call the home phone in their apartment, but there was no answer. When she came home, Pamela was not there, and Mary and her parents began to seriously worry. Pamela was a very responsible person and would never miss her shift without a good reason, especially without notifying management. In addition, if the girl was going to leave somewhere, she would definitely tell her parents and sister about it. Another cause for concern was that Pamela's car was parked in the parking lot of an apartment complex. This fact also reduced the likelihood that the girl had gone somewhere on foot for the whole day. The relatives waited until the next morning and contacted the police. They accepted the missing person report, but were in no hurry to start searching. Pamela was 19 years old, and investigators did not exclude the possibility that she left the house of her own free will. After examining her apartment, detectives found no signs of forced entry or struggle. Everything looked ordinary. They asked her sister to look through Pamela's things and tell her if everything was there. Mary noticed that her coat, terry robe, handbag, and winter boots were missing from their apartment. 2 days after Pamela disappeared, police organized a search operation within a 30-kilometer radius of her home. They inspected fields, forests, and ponds, and volunteers and the girl's relatives distributed leaflets on the city streets. Patrol officers interviewed Pamela's neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances. None of them saw the girl on the day of her disappearance and had no idea where she could have gone. Her supervisor at the hospital said Pamela was supposed to pick up a check for $200 that day, but it never showed up. This further indicated that the girl was unlikely to run away somewhere, leaving behind the money she earned. On the first day of the search, police interviewed more than 100 people who had at least some connection to Pamela. Some of them were interrogated using a polygraph, but this did not bring any results. Investigators also failed to find any evidence that the girl could have left the city. Without a single lead, the police concentrated all their efforts on the search operation. They expanded the zone to approximately 50 kilometers around the city and brought in additional forces, because many areas of the area were inaccessible to pedestrians and vehicles. Multiple officers on horseback were deployed in the search. Speaking to reporters, the sheriff said that this method is the most effective, since a person riding a horse better sees the surrounding space. and the animal itself can smell, for example, the smell of a dead body, and demonstrate this through its behavior. The search continued for a month, but it did not bring any results. As a result, the sheriff decided to suspend the search operation. Since then, the case has virtually frozen, since detectives did not have a single lead on their hands. 2 months after Pamela disappeared, something unusual happened. A patrolman from the city of Great Falls, located 142 kilometers from Helen, stopped a car for speeding. He issued a warning to the woman who was driving and let her go. Later, when he was writing a report at the department, his colleagues noticed one strange thing. The driver's license that the woman showed the officer was issued in the name of Pamela Dorrington. Helen detectives asked a patrolman to describe the woman's appearance. From his words, it really seemed like she was the one driving. This news instilled new hope in the relatives of the missing girl, but investigators were never able to find that car and its driver. On June 13 of that year, almost 4 months after Pamela disappeared, the sheriff's office received a call. The ranger of the national park, located just a few kilometers from Helen, was passing near the lake and noticed a human body in the water. Police arrived at the scene and recovered a human torso from the water, approximately from the waist to the knees. It was handed over to an expert who began examining it and determined that the body belonged to a woman, approximately 17 to 23 years old. Detectives almost immediately made the assumption that the deceased was Pamela Dorrington. Along with the torso, they found several items of clothing that were similar to items from Pamela's wardrobe. They were shown to her sister and parents, and they confirmed that Pamela really had something similar. Medical experts found several stab wounds on her torso, and signs that the girl had been raped. However, it was not possible to establish her identity from her torso alone. All this happened 2 decades before DNA testing began to be used. The only thing that experts could guess was the approximate time the body spent in the water. According to them, it could have been there for about 4 months, which coincided with the time of Pamela's disappearance. Investigators and divers spent the following weeks searching the lake and the adjacent Missouri River, trying to find missing body parts. But this did not bring results. Despite the fact that the deceased could not be identified, the sheriff told reporters that the body was highly likely to belong to Pamela. Therefore, the police were no longer investigating the disappearance of a person, but a murder. However, this discovery did not bring them any closer to the criminal himself, since there was still no clue. Since then, there has been no progress in this matter. The police told journalists and Pamela's relatives that they had several suspects, but it was simply impossible to determine their involvement without any evidence. A year after the murder, the sheriff contacted a psychologist from Detroit who specialized in particularly violent crimes. Based on the available information, he concluded that the criminal was a psychopath with perverted desires, which became the motive for the murder. Given this, he could hardly stop at one murder, and detectives should expect new similar episodes. At the same time, the expert suggested that this person is able to easily hide his true face and lead a normal life. All this information did not help the sheriff much, but he no longer saw any other leads in the investigation. The man told the psychologist the names of his suspects and asked him to evaluate which of them could have committed such a crime. However, the expert could not draw such conclusions without additional evidence. Pamela was buried only 7 years after the murder, on June 14, 1975. During all this time, investigators have never found her other remains, nor are they any closer to catching the culprit. However, they continued to consider a variety of options. Once the detectives even turned to clairvoyance. But the result was quite expected. 15 years after the murder in 1983, something interesting happened. The owner of the apartment that Pamela and Mary rented was found guilty of murdering his wife. In 1968, a man named Brooke Adles lived on the first floor directly below their apartment. He was on the list of possible suspects from the first days, but the complete lack of evidence did not allow any conclusions to be drawn about his involvement. He later married and settled in a private house with his wife. In 1983, their home burned down, and experts quickly determined that it was arson. Moreover, the body of Adel's wife was found in the house. But the cause of her death was not fire. A pathologist determined that she was killed by strangulation. Investigators admitted that the man decided to get rid of his wife and home due to financial problems. Shortly before this, he declared himself bankrupt, and the loss of his insured home could entail a substantial payment from the insurance company. But instead he received a life sentence without parole for murder, plus an additional 20 years for arson. Investigators in Pamela's case became interested in this episode. Adels, who lived literally a meter from the victim, had the opportunity to kill her. The man could use a spare key, and after a month of living next to his sister, he could easily study their work schedule. Detectives spoke with Adels, but he denied all allegations. Considering that there was not a single piece of evidence against him, the police had no choice but to accept it and hope that sooner or later new leads would appear in this case. For the next 38 years, no progress was made. Pamela's parents died without ever knowing the truth, and of her closest relatives, she only had a younger brother left. He had already lost hope of finding out what happened to his sister, but in 2021, this business got another chance. He was transferred to the Unsolved Homicide Unit, and new detectives decided to reopen the investigation. Pamela's murder was not typical for such units. They usually reopened old cases where the criminal had left his DNA. But due to the lack of analysis tools in those years, it was impossible to use this to catch the killer. In Pamela's case, there was no evidence at all, and the detectives could only hope for luck. They studied all the materials left by their predecessors, including a list of possible suspects. Brooke Adels stood out clearly against their background, since he was already in prison for the murder of his wife. At that time, the man was 79 years old, and he continued to serve his sentence. Investigators understood that proving his guilt 53 years later would be very problematic, and the man was unlikely to live to see the verdict. Not only can the trial drag on for many years, but without a single piece of evidence, not a single judge will even consider such a case. Then the detectives decided to approach this issue in a very unusual way. They went to Adels in prison and asked him to confess to killing Pamela. In exchange for this, he was guaranteed that he would not receive any additional punishment for this. Such steps on the part of law enforcement agencies are quite rare, especially when it comes to a brutal murder. But in this particular case, they realized that they only had two options. Wait until they get their hands on some new evidence, which was extremely unlikely, or get a confession. And given Adel's age, the second option could disappear at any moment. Additionally, Pamela's only living close relative was her brother, who was also elderly. The detectives wanted him to find out the truth, told him about the possibility of such a deal, and the man agreed. The investigators conveyed their proposal to Adels and began to wait. To their surprise, it worked. The criminal stated that he was ready to confess to his crime, but the detectives were in no hurry to rejoice. They needed to make sure that the man was really involved in this murder, and not taking the blame for someone else's crime. They spent many hours interrogating him, asking him about the details of the murder. Adels admitted that he planned Pamela's murder in advance. After waiting for her sister to go to work, he went up to their apartment and rang the bell. When Pamela opened the door, he told her that one of the pipes in her apartment had a leak, and it is urgent to carry out repair work. Pamela let the man in. Once in the apartment, he attacked her and strangled the girl, after which he took the body to his apartment and subjected him to violence. This was precisely the main motive for the deed. Next, Adels placed it in a barrel and took it to the warehouse of a small airport where he worked as a flight instructor. On that very day, a few hours after the murder, the man calmly taught several lessons to his students. The barrel stood in the warehouse for several days, after which Adels took it to the banks of the Missouri River, divided the body, and threw it into the water. In addition, the man told the police several facts that were never disclosed, so only the killer could know them. With all this information in hand, the detectives no longer doubted that Adels was telling the truth. After 53 years, they finally managed to solve this case, although to do this they had to guarantee the killer's full immunity. It is noteworthy that the killer decided to agree to the deal for a reason. He stated that during his imprisonment he believed in God and began to feel remorse and apologized to Pamela's relatives for what he had done. The Detroit psychologist's analysis turned out to be quite accurate. Adels actually seemed like a decent person. For a long time he worked as a heavy equipment operator. Then he began teaching flying lessons, started a family, and only after the murder of his wife his true essence became clear. A victim's brother thanked investigators for bringing the case to completion. The man understood that a guilty verdict and an additional life sentence for Adels would not change anything. And thanks to the detectives, this case was put to rest.